This conference will now be recorded.
Is anybody out there able to hear us? Garrett says me too.
1 second.
Yeah,
Yes,
you
we can
guys
hear you now.
just came on.
What's that?
We just came on with sound.
Okay. Did you click something?
I unmuted myself.
Okay.
But this,
So if you
this
guys,
guy was,
if you
We'll
guys
start-
could
we'll start
start
beginning.
again. Yeah,
Sure.
awesome.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, sorry about that. It looks like our conference phone is not working for some reason, but we're actually going to fly through the computer.
yeah.
Awesome. Way to use the chat. Thanks for letting us know. That would have been a very long presentation with a large attrition rate. Okay, everybody. Well, thanks again. Thanks for hanging through us. Yes, technical updates and technical difficulties. So today we just wanted to talk through a few things. I was saying how it's probably going to be a little bit more of us presenting, which is good that you can hear now. But we wanted to kind of quickly cover budget and timeline, especially because timeline was something the group really wanted to talk a lot about and have maybe a more simplified breakout of kind of where things are headed with regards to the BIP updates. And then we wanted to kind of step through just what we see as the 10 or so major topics that we had covered with this group as those directly feed into draft recommendations. And then we'll talk through kind of that summary of draft recommendations and next steps from there. So kind of starting with that first topic and thinking about budget, you'll recall we probably last summer had started kind of thinking through this idea of asking for a larger budgetary ask to carry us through the next 4 years of work and really build right on the heels of the technical update into updating BIPs and then ultimately updating the water plan itself. Now that the legislative session's over, we know that we've got this approved request through the projects bill. I think it was, passed with no objections, which is great. We intend to carry forward as we had proposed. So with about 65% of those, the average cost of the last BIPs was somewhere in that 265, 290K range. We had really kind of tried to break out a similar chunk of that across each basin to really help do these updates. And so we'll talk through a little bit more of that, but it's good news, and we're really excited to have that funding. Some of that funding is also going to go to things like improving House Bill 1051 reporting and database, and then also developing this IPP or projects database that we've talked about. But certainly the bulk of it really is aimed at working with the basins and providing some support to update the BIPs and then updating the water plan itself. So that process, as we've talked through before, is going to, follow a general contractor model, especially given a lot of the comments that we've heard pretty regularly, whether it's, at basin roundtable meetings or even in this working group calls, just that, basins are largely, it's a volunteer group, and that it's, somewhat of a heavy lift and taking on extra work, especially when there are other big projects out there like the demand management discussions, that it would be nice to have some support. So we're really hoping that this general contractor model provides that. And we've also, at the all chairs call that we had last week, we talked about having and inviting all the chairs of the roundtables to be on the selection committee for this general contractor. And we see that as an important step because we have heard feedback and just, curiosity of, would the RFP be public? Yes, it definitely will be public and everybody can see it. But we wanted to let the roundtables have some level of insight into that process and help us select the right GC that can then be used to bring on these local contractors. And there was a question we talked through, we were discussing with the North Platte yesterday, but they had a question about that. And so to be clear, we see it as the general contractor would have a list of any, basically any subcontractor they could potentially work with. And that allows some flexibility down the road for them to bring on whoever they want. So there's not a lot of pressure early on for those local experts to have to be selected. Although we would like to kind of start to develop a list of all those potential subcontractors that could be used. So that could be anybody that's ever done work in the basin, anybody that's ever done work for the roundtable, just to put them on, the general contractor list once that GC is selected, and that would be later in the procurement process. So we'll probably be drafting a bit of a list around that we can send out, probably just following up with the chairs to bring back to the roundtables and help us flesh that out a bit. But we wanted to highlight here that this local experts, we've had some questions. I know we were talking with the Arkansas, and they said, well, what is the local expert? I think as we're seeing it, the local expert is really a chief integrator or some level of facilitator. They're the primary person that's going to be working directly with that roundtable on some level as adjunct staff to really both understand what the roundtable needs are and then help the roundtable kind of articulating some of the complex topics that we've discussed on these calls around modeling and where we're at and where we want to go. So that chief integrator would really work with the GC hand in hand. There may be a need to bring on other local experts. So if one basin is really interested in some environmental issue that they want to have looked at, there may be some funds that are there. So there could be additional local advisors that get brought on potentially. It also may be the case that the general contractor that gets hired is the local expert for that basin. So, if you can think about who wrote your BIP initially, if that's the same person you think that you might want to use again, and they're the people that get selected as the general contractor on this project, then you can imagine that maybe there's just some combining of funds there that allow you to kind of, not spread out, but consolidate some of those fundings to do the work that you have in front of you. So a bit of a reminder, just where we've kind of been over this last year, just if you think kind of summer of 2018 to summer of 2019, we did see, in keeping with the water plan, the goals of initiating the BIP updates in 2018. That largely started with this kind of scoping and procurement discussions for us of, was there a better way to kind of engineer this funding solution, and then also really putting out a survey at Water Congress of, what kind of support would be welcomed by roundtables. And then we had our first kickoff call with this group, the Implementation Working Group, in December of 2018. Our goal is to conclude both this working group and technical update in July. as I said, we've kind of got July marked as a placeholder. Really, we see our next June meeting is probably the last for this working group unless there's a strong desire and need to have another. But we are slated to have the technical update released on July 18th at the board meeting, which will be in the Arc Basin. We don't have exact location nailed down yet. But for the second half, that's the 18th is actually the second day of the board meeting, and we're thinking of combining that latter half of that day with a joint IBCC meeting and kind of making that a bit of the release effort or release party, if you will, for the technical update. So now getting to the more granular timeline of where we go, if we kind of looking at July as that stake in the ground technical updates out, and then we have the C9 Summit, C9 Summit being in September. It's really a 2-year effort, kind of looking at September 2019 to September of 2021, with that first year still focused a bit on procurement and really looking at IPPs, and second year being more focused on document update and kind of spanning those two, maybe some of the any additional analysis that basins would want to dig into. So here's what that kind of looks like on a more granular level. As you can see, I think Mike Shimon kind of put it well our last call. He said, I think it was something like, work's not going to happen until you have people, kind of hired and then on board. We get that, and we understand. We're certainly not trying to rush this through. We our own RFP, we're hoping to have that out soon, but, assuming that that's another month, would be lucky, and we're hopeful we can hit it, but it may be even a little bit after this date. But if we can have that general contractor hired by the C9 Summit, that would be our goal. And then effectively leaving through the end of the year into beginning of next to get any local experts hired and on board. And then that we see the next kind of level, the next phase of work really being the IPPs and digging into the projects. The project list good, what projects need to, maybe have come off the list, what new ones are on. And then we've talked a lot, and we'll revisit this here in a minute, but about the data in the IPPs and especially around cost and getting those kind of nailed down. And then the remainder of that time, really looking at any analysis basins want to do, and then updating the BIPs themselves. We are trying to, and even in thinking about this monetary ask, really to be wise with the funds that we have. We understand that updating the BIPs on some level is updating the water plan. There's so much of it that directly feeds into the water plan. So we hope to have the general contractor kind of working in tandem on both efforts. And then the water plan itself, looking at a 2022 release date. I'm almost certainly we'd be trying to get a draft out in early 2022, have some kind of open comment period, and then have a final, probably to coincide with the, that would be the 7-year anniversary of the water plan. I just wanted, this is not a full list of everybody that's been involved in this group, so sorry if your name got truncated in this little running stream, but I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that's been a part of these calls. We've had a lot of great dialogue and great input, and we kind of showed a similar slide at the board meeting that we were sat in the Gunnison, and it was just wanted to hit pause and say thanks to everybody that's been a part of this effort, making these calls and kind of digging through these issues with us, and also for your time, communicating back to roundtables and help us understanding issues and what's of most important. So with that, I will walk through, unless there are any questions, kind of the main areas that we've talked through with this team, and then we'll kind of end on, and we may end early, and we'll probably have a lot of time at the end for discussion, but certainly feel free to chime in if you have questions either in the chat or bring something up. So first thing we talked about is just this need for getting better data, and what is, if we're going to get better data, what's the kind of range of things that we need to get data on? We've done some work as part of the technical update and kind of developed this list of 20. This is maybe slightly revised from the version that you've seen before, but it's all the same thing. It's just kind of restructured a bit. The two things that the working group that we kind of heard loud and clear, I think Melly and maybe Jackie had brought up, if not others, just to also have a consideration for water rights and then also permitting. So those we need to think about maybe how, what's the thing we're measuring there, or what's the, how do we work that in? But I flagged those two here just to show that we've talked about data needs, and so we now have maybe a list of 22 things potentially. We've also talked about cost. So again, showing this slide of all the data needs that we have, perhaps cost is right up there at the top of one of the most important, just because it's so pivotal to a lot of the planning that's going on and really supporting funding that goes back to the roundtables, and increasingly as funding, whether it's through this, the gambling initiative that's coming through, or any other, campaigns, just the need to really get our house in order is kind of more and more apparent, and it's called out specifically in the water plan. You can see that, at best, 50% of the IPPs that we have costs associated, and some don't have any. And the water plan took that into account, and it's certainly backfilled with, I think what were considered to be some solid estimates of how to kind of round up on some of these numbers and understand what those true costs might be, but they could certainly be refined. And so that's why we've kind of broken out in that timeline of seeing, if you think about the beginning of next year through maybe the summer of next year as being a real focus in digging into the IPPs, which ones are good, and trying to really get some good costs, especially now that we have this costing tool that's out there as a beta. We're seeing that as hopefully something that the general contractor or local experts, the roundtables can utilize to get costs where maybe they didn't have them before. So really looking to help refine that effort. We talked about the scope of the updates, and Megan had done a really great job and sent out these one-pagers of kind of just things to consider that might be talking points. Again, the data and the data gaps across these 20 or now 22 kind of data sets were shown on there. And we talked about just this contractor, general contractor, local expert model with the group. We talked about the need to do a tier evaluation, and we shared this tier matrix. I thought we got some really good input last time. I remember Phil said specifically, I think it looks good. I think it just probably needs to go out to a wider audience to review. I remember Melly had some comments on that too, just kind of asking the question of how helpful this would be. And so again, this would be one of those things we'd be looking to move forward. And as with all these things, I'll just remind the group that this is really the first bite at the apple, but there are certainly many bites to be had, and we're really, the intent has always been to use this group as a bit of a focus group to tell us, are we on track, or, what trajectory might we need to shift to, and so everything moving forward is really framed up around recommendations of looking into things further. It's certainly not a hard set of doing a thing, so just tear that up. So we talked a lot I remember this was our meeting that we had shared with PEPO, and we've talked about this a lot, but just a need to really get some, rebrand around the water plan, and that makes sense for a number of levels. One, because we are always working on the water plan, and yet we've had this kind of random thing, the SWASI, that sounds like a discrete effort, when really the technical update is the bedrock of the water plan, and it's the foundation. And because we've really been intentional about, through this working group, or just the way that we're laying out this general contractor process of having this be an iterative effort where the basins can really help us dig in and refine data, refine the projects for sure. We're really looking at this as a collective effort. And I think we had gotten, even in early focus groups too, some, I remember one of the comments that came back, I think from the South Platte, was just, gosh, I don't really always understand how to message this even to a utility. So reframing things around the water plan just makes sense in a lot of ways, just for simplifying the message and hopefully even bringing on new stakeholders. At our last meeting, and this is where I think we kind of got into this just very lightly, but we talked about adaptive planning. This is certainly a lot of the thought process that went into the water plan, and were things that Basins and IBCC was working on kind of prior to the water plan, a lot around just kind of developing the scenarios, obviously developing portfolios for those scenarios of, what sets of actions might make sense under one of these future scenarios. But it also really kind of framed back and referenced the Nolo regrets. So all of these efforts are kind of looking at a timeline of signposts. Those signposts may be seen as time. They could also be seen as triggers potentially of things that Basin would need to be responsive to. But the idea is that on some level, whether it's some indicator of time or other, that you're reviewing where you're at, what trajectory you might be on, or what combination of one of these features you might be looking at, and adjusting plans based on observed trends. So for those Nolo regrets, we're really seeing those as, and I think it says something very similar to this in the water plan, but they're effectively core strategies in the water plan And their goal is to invest in actions that have few or no disadvantages in terms of cost and benefits, regardless of the future. So the idea being that on some level, at least for a while, these, future trajectories may track together, and that if you can kind of say what are the, kind of looking at that 80-20 rule, what are the kind of 80% of things that we might be able to look at that kind of help us out under any possible future, it makes sense as strategies. And as a reminder, those Nolo regrets got 100% consensus by the IBCC, and were approved by the board. So, our thought is that they're referenced in the water plan. It probably makes sense for basins to go back, revisit those core strategies, see if they still make sense, and then kind of go back and see how their projects tie into those. Do they relate? Do the strategies need to be revisited? And how are basins looking at how they could adapt if they see their future changing? This group also helped us, and we sent this out as a draft, I think our meeting before last, but the roadmap, or what was previously the Basin Implementation Plan guidance. Again, it was that initial 10-page effort that CWCB had led. This time, we really wanted this group to help inform that. On some level, this 2-pager is almost a roll-up of everything that we're talking about today. It's just very high level, but the intent was for it to be a super digestible, very short, something that we could pass out at the C9 Summit that would kind of help set the stage where things are going. So really appreciate the feedback that this team provided on that. We are going to, at the end of this week, and we'll talk about this with regards to a couple of documents today, we're going to send around a draft of the C9 Summit. We've got a lot of questions. I think Jim Pokrant's on the phone. He wanted to know, I think in all chairs call it, ask about, how maybe other efforts that they're working on, like with regards to risk study might be incorporated, and we've had some ideas on that. I think we heard some things around forest health or just plan integration overall. So we tried to be responsive to that, so we're kind of just noodling on that agenda, but we'd like to send that out to get this group's input on, and we will aim to send that out on Friday. The last time we met, we talked about modeling, and I remember it got kind of deep quick, and we got some good feedback from this team of, gosh, like some of this, you're really in the weeds on something that is probably for, at least a cursory pass for roundtables, too much. It's a bit over their head. So what we wanted to do is maybe, because we did hear a lot about what slides would I show my roundtable, if you wanted to show something on modeling, this could be it, and we can step through it here, but there's some higher level order of magnitude things that just need to be considered that I really tee up, I think, the Basin Implementation Plan updates. But we did not model IPPs. We did not model projects. A lot of this is because we were not sure on the data. We didn't have the data that we needed to be able to model them. We didn't know in cases where there was maybe a yield number, if that water was coming from the same place, if we were double counting. So there's a lot that could be done to clear that up. There's also a lot of complexity around modeling projects in general that basins will probably have to think through, just in terms of if you're modeling it and somebody else is modeling it, or your model is conflicting, and what does that do with regards to maybe a project that's in the middle of a permitting effort. So there's a lot, I think, to dig into around IPPs outside of just getting better data, but then once you have that, how do you model it? How do you show what projects are going to fill a certain gap? Another thing is the BIPs each took somewhat different approach to breaking out subbasins. Sometimes not in the way that maybe we would have thought about it before, or in earlier iterations of Swazi, for example. But we did not know the rationale behind some of the breakouts or how beneficial those breakouts actually were. So while the data may be in the model, we kept things rolled up to the basin level. So again, another task that basins can kind of dig into is deciding what level of breakout makes sense. I think in the Colorado BIP, for example, they had maybe 9 different kind of subbasins. Is that helpful? Is it helpful to have 3? Is the higher level good enough? Those are the kind of questions that basins will need to think about in the BIP update process. So we did follow the tag direction. That's all documented. It's online. Certainly some of the decisions that we made were directly informed by that effort. However, there were a number of other issues that came up that we just didn't necessarily anticipate. There's more granular level of detail. We've been documenting those so that the local expert, general contractor, and the roundtables can really follow our work and kind of say, does it at least understand why or where we made certain assumptions or changes that change the outcomes of the model, and they can help us think through if we got that right. We modeled 5 scenarios. So, we talk a lot about scenario planning. I think it's a different thing when you see one set of data that's kind of mind-numbing when you're digging through pages of data or graphs, and then all of a sudden you've got 5 times that much to look at. So there's a question, I think, of how helpful that data is ultimately, and if 5 scenarios still make sense, or if they do, if any of them would need to change. And that's another thing that basins can kind of help us think through. And then this issue that we talked about of signposts, whether that's triggers or frequency, that wasn't included in the technical update budget, for example, and it's something that we think could be discussed in this kind of BIT update process and really help us set the stage for kind of frequency moving forward for updates even. So with that, all those things kind of feed into all the things that I just stepped through, feed into these kind of what we're calling, whether it's a section, a subsection, subchapter, or chapter on recommendations. We think that there will be, we're going to include some level of this detail in the technical update that basically is a documentation of the things that we discussed, the issues that we came across doing the technical update, and kind of setting the stage for things that basins probably need to consider, especially through that general contractor model. And I would even add, especially as a group through that general contractor model. One thing that the GC can do is bring together all of the local experts, and we really are trying to be intentional about that for a few reasons. One, because I think it helps ground truth. If one basin's thinking about something in terms of modeling and another is thinking differently, there could be some middle ground of just kind of groupthink of what makes the most sense moving forward. So I think there's some benefit just collaboratively. We also heard a lot from basins about wanting to, increase, how they interact with other basins and maybe thinking about possibilities of teaming up on case studies, for example. And there's probably going to be some budget to do that in certain basins. So we're hoping that can really feed this effort. So with that, we're going to step through and feel free. We'll kind of maybe try to hit pause. We've broken out these recommendations into 5 main areas, and then they've kind of got some sub bullets. Oh, Heather says the audio is going in and out.
Can we try to call back in on the number here?
I don't know. I'm always worried.
Is
anyone else having issues with audio? Okay.
Oh, Sean says it works fine. Okay, maybe ping Heather, ping us again if it's still coming up. We could maybe figure out a way to dial you separately if we need to. So again, we'll step through these one at a time, and each of these have sub bullets. So let's see if I can just get it. Okay, so kind of first bucket of things in terms of recommendations are just updating the BIP. First step in that is just determining the scope. Like that roadmap that we shared with you, that you provided input on, there's kind of what we're seeing as some core things that need to get done, and then there's this selection of, maybe more nice to have or really important for one basin they want to focus on. The idea being that there's some level of standard things. So a good example would be updating IPPs that all basins need to do. But then there's some ability for basins to tailor what's most effective and what's important for them. So determining what that exact scope is something that obviously basins need to do as a first step. Seems like kind of no-brainer recommendation, but we're just really trying to tee up what this update's about. We have talked a lot about integrating plans, whether those are stream management plans. I remember some folks on this call talked about forest health or maybe even fire. Could be resilience or climate plans. Could be other modeling efforts that are going on in basins. But there's probably a list of studies or plans, certainly that have come out since the original BIPs that probably need to be referenced or integrated into the BIP updates. So that would be another recommendation, is for basins to kind of dig into what is that range of plans that are out there or studies and think about how those could be integrated. Those could be at the state level, certainly they could be at the local level. Get better data if you have it. We talked a lot about modeling. The model is only as good as the data you put into it. In some cases, whether a basin decides that they want to do additional modeling or not, there's probably some data that they have access to that we just don't have. So a good example might be for House Bill 1051, we're getting all the covered entities. That's not all the entities. So if, you're in the Rio and you think that the muni numbers don't look right and you know that you can get, data from a local municipal provider that's not reporting to House Bill 1051, there may be an ability to get some more granular data that we don't have access to. So kind of a call to get better data into the model if you have it, and then from there it could be used for additional modeling or not. It could just be better data that allows us to do different level of analysis on. Evaluate areas for improvement. This one is really just the way to say we know that, whether it's SWASI 2010 or this technical update, that there's going to be some folks that don't necessarily agree with how something was put forward, or maybe don't, questioning the model, or maybe, maybe just even how a certain graph represents something. A good example of this would be what I think we've heard several times is, don't talk to me about the ag gap. We're short in every year and we're dealing with it, right? And in this technical update, we're really trying to talk more about incremental gaps and have that be the focus. But we may not have gotten it right, or there may be a better way to frame it up that we haven't thought of. So for the folks in the room that, when the technical update is released, take issue with certain things, we'd really like to, turn that energy into a positive and say, help us work with this to make it right. We're going to have legal constraints. Everything that we do in this next update is going to have to be done under the guidance of the Attorney General, and there are probably going to be some sideboards on what we can do. That being said, there's a lot of latitude of things that we could dig into, and we really want basins help in doing that, and we really want this to be of benefit for each basin as well. So, tell us where we can make things better and help us do that. Any questions on that section? Okay. So then next is project updates. We're trying to maybe start to get away from a lot of the acronyms that we use, and IPPs is one of them, but just really talking about projects, understanding that projects could be processes as well, or programs for that matter, or they could be, a scoping effort, but really just getting a better handle, update the projects. And so a part of that is getting better data and really focusing in on project costs as well. Again, outside of any other efforts that are happening to look at funding, it's really just a question of getting our house in order and making sure that we're being wise stewards of funding that we're asking for, and that we can really well articulate the dollars that are going back to the roundtables and make that case whenever we get questions from the legislature. So, irregardless of anything that would come up, from, a ballot initiative, this is just kind of makes sense kind of proposition, and we're hoping that the costing tool can really be helpful in doing this. And we're also helping the general contractor model allows a lot of support for what probably would be a fairly intensive effort if the roundtables were left just to update data alone. Just a lot of follow-up with people on trying to get data in, and that's always time intensive. And then again, just help using this tier matrix that we talked about, help us evaluate how tiering might make sense. So we talked, I think, in the last meeting about how, of all the BIPs, I think 3 include some level of tiering. We've, tried to brainstorm around this matrix and gotten good feedback from you all. To Phil's point, take it to the broader group. That's exactly what this bullet is intended to mean, is let's take it out there and see how that or some version of it or what level of tiering might make sense to use. And understanding some of the caveats and good points we heard from Kevin, I think, brought up. This shouldn't be used to pit one basin against another. Absolutely. We couldn't agree more. But there is a need, I think, especially as more funding potentially comes on the table, just to be able to say what projects are ready to go, that fill a certain need, that fit into the buckets that we have from the legislature, and to be able to better explain that. Any questions around this one? So then technical updates. This is really geared up around this modeling discussion. So we had that slide we just talked through about kind of all the complexities that go into modeling. We know that some basins like the Yampa are doing a lot with modeling. There are other basins that, maybe are not where they're at or have a strong desire to do additional modeling. So that's a question. So in this kind of, we talked about just a second ago, the general contractor and this roadmap would kind of help work with basins to tailor, their approach. I could very easily see some basins wanting to dig more into modeling and some not, and that's totally fair. Do you want to model projects? So this question we talked around IPPs and the projects not being modeled in the technical update. It probably makes sense to proceed. At the same time, there's the pros and cons issues that we just talked about of, if you're modeling a project, it's a project that's in the middle of permitting, if that can conflict at all. So just being thoughtful about that process and really letting the basins drive that effort. And then this issue we talked about again, do you need sub-basin results? They may be easier or harder to pull out of the model depending on how boundaries are drawn. If they're drawn, by a stream, then that's probably fairly easy. If they're something like the Metro has kind of maybe more amorphous boundary set, maybe not, then you could pull that out easier or not. But we really wanted to revisit the last BIPs and have the basins tell us, did the sub-basin breakouts that they did provide any value? Would they do them the exact same way, and would they want to model that way, or would there be some new way? So that's what this one's kind of meant to wrap up. Any questions on this? Okay, 4. We're almost the home stretch here. So number 4 or 5. 4 is a strategic update. So this is really more getting to this idea of, we've embedded climate into climate change into 3 of the scenarios, 3 of the 5 scenarios. There's a lot of focus, whether it's, it doesn't necessarily have to be climate. There's a lot of drivers in the water plan. Could be economy. How are basins set up to be responsive? A lot of work went into the portfolios early on that are associated with each of these scenarios. So, are basins really well positioned to bring in certain types of projects if they see that things are trending a certain way? So just really thinking about how plans could be adaptive. Certainly a part of that is just this plan integration, I think. Help us think through the signpost discussion and whether that, whether our specific triggers, if those could be at a state level or if those are more at a basin level. Maybe they're unique in some basins, or maybe it is just kind of the time of, okay, every 5-7 years we're going to update the water plan, and that collective effort of the technical update, BIP updates, and water plan update. We're going to look at all these things and see what trajectory we think we're at that cycle. And then I think an honest evaluation of how helpful are the scenarios. Again, with 5 different data sets, you get quite a fan of data, quite a lot of data to dig through. We want to be open and honest about that process too, as some level of a big experiment that we started probably 2012, 2013 and carried through into the water plan. If those need to be tweaked, we need to hear that. If maybe looking at 3 of the 5 is more helpful, then we should probably think about that too. So just want your help in thinking through if they're great as they are, that's great too. So, but we'd like to have the basins kind of help inform and revisit scenario planning on some level. Any questions there? So the last one, we started, I think, one of our first implementation working group meetings, if not the first, was the one that we did with PEPO. We wanted to make sure that we, brought that outreach piece into this as well. So we want to engage or re-engage existing stakeholders, but also really think about new stakeholders. We worked with PEPO and the basins to kind of realign the education action plans that really time up well with this BIP update so that it could be on some level integrated. And then we also heard from PEPO just this desire to really kind of brand or rebrand around the water plan. And so this last outreach effort is really kind of aimed at thinking about both those efforts. And then I'll also add some of our goals in the water plan, and education is one of them, have a much nearer timeline. So as we near or pass that timeline, what are the new goals that we're going to set? And maybe having basins help think about that and inform what those new goals or metrics should be would be a very helpful endeavor as well. Any questions around this? So with that, this is the full list. We are going to provide a little bit more detail, probably in the draft we send. It may still be kind of shorter bullets under each of these. Ultimately, we'll probably write it into more of a paragraph form. But we'd like to send this out along with the draft C9 agenda. So this is draft chapter, draft C9. Would like to say again, we do not necessarily, you're welcome, as with all of this stuff, to share anything that you want with your roundtable. Timing-wise, we really need to start drafting and designing the technical update. So for edits to get in, we're really going to need to have those responses come in quickly and get things back to us so that we can start to kind of frame that up. That timing is probably not going to allow for the majority of people to revisit any of this with roundtable. So please, keep in mind that you're the first pass, or the inaugural class, if you will, of what we are going to be revisiting with everyone else in your basin through this general contractor process. So all of these, hopefully, you're not getting the impression that any of this is overly prescriptive. Again, all these things are really framed up as things that hopefully make sense to you all, and that we've, I think, seen support from this group to dig into. And they're open for some level of interpretation. We heard a lot. I think Kevin did a good job articulating where, in some cases, you're just not going to have data, for example. So, when you're looking at this, don't feel the weight of the world to, get it right. Just help us frame up maybe some of the pros and cons, if you're seeing that we need to make sure that we mention. So it could be that, right? That you're going to have, we need to get better data, but we are also cognizant that we may not always have it, and that doesn't necessarily need to be a black mark on a project, for example. But there's probably some subset of that data that is really critical, or even, easy to get, like the project name, that we don't always have now. So we will send both of those draft documents out by Friday to this team. And this next slide is just saying we'd like to get your feedback by May 31st. So it's basically giving you a week to look things over. It shouldn't be a ton of effort, hopefully. I think that where we're at, it's about 4 pages.
Yeah.
It's about 4 pages, but it's bullets, and it's got a lot of white space there too. So hopefully it's not too deep of a dive, but send us anything you got, and then at our next meeting, we'd really be teeing up to kind of revisit those 2 documents and get your input, take anything else that you guys might have to add, and then probably look at ending this effort. So with that, we'll just open up for general questions and discussion, and I would just like to say a big thanks to everybody on the phone and who's been a part of this effort that maybe isn't on the phone. It's been a long haul, but I'm really pleased with where we're at and appreciate you guys very much.
If you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in.
I feel like we must have audio issues because we always have a lively dialogue.
There's a lot of information.
Feel free to use the chat box too.
Feels like a Monday.
It does.
With the snow. Also, you guys can always follow up via email. This will be posted on the web later this afternoon or tomorrow morning, this webinar. So we'll make sure to get that up along with the slides. Heather asked, can you talk a bit more about the agenda for the C9 Summit?
Great question, Heather. Thank you so much for asking. Yes, so I think one higher level thing, we talked about this with the all chairs, is it's absolutely our goal and hope that the C9 Summit can really be setting the stage for the VIP update. So to that end, the more that we can focus topics on that would be helpful. So for example, we've talked with this team about how modeling is very complex. I think it would probably be a fair discussion to maybe have a panel that talks about, maybe a couple of the modeling efforts that are going on in the state, and talk about just assumptions that feed a model, and maybe talk about things and tee it up that way, rather than discrete presentations on certain topics. At least that's how we're thinking about it. A lot of this is open for discussion for sure, and we'd like your input. But I think we see some of it as a bit of the, high level. It will have been 2 months since the release of the technical update. We're going to plan on doing something at Water Congress as well, so hopefully we'll get a lot of that out. But with any hope, we can kind of set the stage. So a lot of the agenda that you'll see sets the stage for, what are the gaps that we're seeing? What was the analysis that went into the technical update? What are these 20 assumptions or so that we talked about? What are those? And then have some panel sessions that are made up of teams. So Heather, we may even ping you to be on a panel. You'll actually see your name is on one right now. So this idea of plan integration, for example, I thought that people like you and Nicole Seltzer and maybe Devin Buckles, and trying to get people from across the basins to really talk about what's plan integration look like in their basin, and how, what are the difficulties they found in trying to bring different plans together, and what are the successes there too. So we have a panel session on that. We talked about maybe a panel session on modeling, and then we wanted to at least have one breakout session, whether it's this group or IBCC. We hear a lot about just letting people talk and not us talking to them. We know we're breaking that badly today, but we wanted to have a breakout session that maybe is a little bit of a diving into VIP planning updates, and maybe getting a little of those hopes and fears out on the table for people to kind of report out on. So that's a rough idea, and we'll send you this more granular version on Friday. Does that help?
So I had another question from Barbara Vasquez. Would like to see a report out at C9 on best non-consumptive projects accomplished since the last BIP from other basins. Good question, Barbara. Good statement. As Russ had just articulated, going through kind of the draft agenda, I'm not sure how much time we'll have necessarily to focus on specific projects, but this is one of those concepts that we've been kicking around a lot internally, and specifically with updates to something like our ripple effects report, to really keep that going. That was, our way of really documenting the successes on, all things water plan, and including specific projects, but to do, a retrospective of sorts, hopefully later this year, that would ideally coincide with the C9 Summit, that would highlight successful projects in different basins. So non-consumptive and consumptive, but to really be able to have some of those kind of poster child projects, if you will, that we could really put out there and show how we're successfully achieving a lot of the goals of the water plan. So hopefully something like that would help speak to that question, Barbara. And again, a lot of work to be done, but that's definitely something on our radar, is to really highlight a lot of the good work that's being done around the state.
And Barbara, you had also asked if we could share a draft of the C9 agenda. What I can do is I can put together just maybe a single slide that captures effectively the bullets I just talked through now about what we think the scope might be. I'd really like to let this group weigh in on what it is before we share it publicly, and the whole intent of having this group is to use it as a sounding board. Of course, the group is always welcome to share it outside, but our hope is that they just kind of give us some direct feedback of, I think you should also be thinking about this, and then we can reframe it and send it out to everyone at the same time. So if that works for you, I will just put together at least one slide on the kinds of things that we think we're going to be talking about at the C9 Summit, because it's certainly not set in stone at this point. Perfect.
Any other thoughts on the phone?
Just another reminder, we've got our second to last technical webinar coming up for the tech update at noon today. It will be focusing on the environmental and recreational data and tools that we'll be releasing in July with the water plant tech update. So for those interested, please feel free to tune in, and we are also recording those, and of course all those are posted with a YouTube link on the water plan website.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Oh, go ahead.
This is Kevin. I just wanted to check and see if your if your audio is working. So it's a little overwhelming to think about. So I think that's part of the silence.
Well, great. Well, hopefully we can utilize our next meeting. We'll send out a draft on Friday, and then you guys will be able to dig through that. You can certainly send us written responses, but hopefully our last call can really just be much more of a dialogue of, what you liked, what you didn't like about what we could potentially change. And if we get some feedback, by the 31st, we'll be able to integrate that and maybe have a more fleshed out version that we can share. So I'm really hoping our last call will have more chance. Maybe it's almost all just us talking as a team on any last thoughts that we want, captured.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. We definitely get that this is a lot to process. And again, as Russ had kind of alluded to, this we really want to keep reassuring folks that this is the start of a long conversation, and it's it's going to be an iterative process as we work with the roundtables to update everything. But we're certainly excited to have the funding and and have some of these pieces in place to at least get the ball rolling. But we know it's going to be a long process working through all this.
Yeah. Thanks again, Kevin, for your thoughts and being on the phone. And it is overwhelming. It's basically we're laying the framework for the next 2 years of work. So it is hard to kind of see all that laid out, and it can't help but feel overwhelming. But hopefully we've provided the timing and support tools to make it really manageable. All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for being on the call. Nobody's ever sad when you get out of a meeting early, I don't think. So we'll leave it there, and we'll send out those documents Friday. Look for your comments by the 31st, and then look forward to wrapping things up on our last call next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again.